Today's reading is from the book of John. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abided in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends, if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants anymore, because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you. And I appoint you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. I am giving you these commandments so that you may love one another. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. The epistle reading today is from 1 John 5. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God, and everyone who loves the parent loves the child. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and obey his commandments. For the love of God is this, that we obey his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. For whatever is born of God conquers the world, and this is the victory that conquers the world, our faith. Who is that conquers the world but the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? This is the one who come by water and blood, Jesus Christ, not with the water only, but with the water and the blood. And the Spirit is the one that testifies, for the Spirit is the truth.
As far as my father was concerned, every day was Mother's Day in our house. Now, before you take him for a hopeless romantic, understand that this is a man who has carried on a lifelong grudge against commercial sentimentality. Hallmark cards and flower shops have him on their no-call list. Now, I have no idea what he ever says to my mother in public, and kids should never have any idea about that, But I can assure you that he doesn't say, "I love you," with cards, candy, or roses. Now, every day being Mother's Day could mean that Mother's Day doesn't mean much, but I can assure you, growing up in our household, that was not the case. See, every day being Mother's Day meant that my father made it abundantly clear to us kids that your mother and I are one. And that meant that if we ever had the inclination to disrespect our mother, we should know that that was disrespecting our father too. And it was more than that. He would allow no cleavage at all between the two of them in terms of our love for them. You had to love my dad by loving Mom. And it's one of the sweetest ways I think he loves her still. Happy Mother's Day, Mom. 1 John says something like this about our relationship to God, Jesus, and other Christians. The author of this epistle, whom scholars call John the Elder, uses family imagery to describe the proper posture of the heart that we are to have toward Jesus and each other in the church if we are to be believed that we love God. God will allow no cleavage between our love for God and our love for the Son of God. And then it goes beyond that to God will allow no cleavage either in our love for the Son of God and our love for other sons and daughters of God who are brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ in the church. Now, when I say that God will not allow anything but love for Jesus and our neighbors, or that my Father required us to love our mother if we were to prove we loved him, we are now getting into the language of obedience and commandments and imperatives. And our modern minds have a hard time grasping how love and obedience can go together. They seem, on the surface, to be opposites. Obedience is something you are forced to do, while love is something that arises naturally out of you. Obedience involves sacrifice of the will. It means giving up your choice to love or not to love. But how can you love when you're just not feeling it, we think? I think we are wading into deep waters here. We are diving right down to the bottom of what the Christian life is about. Love and obedience are a paradox, it is true, but not an unresolvable one. A paradox, you understand, may appear to be self-contradictory, but it may be resolved and point to an even deeper truth. Let's see how that might be the case with love and obedience. So first, love involves obedience. Now, this is tricky because it's easy when I say that for you to hear that means that the two are always positively related, and that is not so. Love always involves obedience, but obedience does not always involve love. For example, a husband may demand obedience from his wife more as an act of power over her than love for her. And the wife may obey him in a way that sacrifices her dignity and pride rather than as an act of love. And in that case, obedience does not involve love. A cult leader or a pastor with a knack for manipulation may demand obedience and call it love, but it is nothing really more than an abuse of power. And again, in that case, obedience does not involve love. But love involves obedience when the heart is so taken captive by a command that delights in the demand. We talk about falling in love as if it's something that just happens to you, where you feel like you just can't help yourself, right? It just is what it is, don't you know? And I think that's true, but it's true in the sense that Jesus says here, "You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you." In other words, when you surrender to love, it's a kind of obedience to something that has now taken authority over your heart. You feel like you have been chosen, and now it's not that your choice is deprived of you, but rather that it is enabled. It makes it possible for you to choose love in return. You have been loved first, and now you may love. That response is a kind of surrender and an obedience that is good. So when Jesus tells us that we must obey God's commandments if we are to prove that we love God, all that means is that we are to obey the call to our heart, that we should love in return. Which leads to the second point. Obedience is about loving one another, or it is not Christian obedience. If you want a handy way of knowing whether the command to obey someone should be followed, Well, you should ask yourself whether it's intended to build up and to add dignity and worth to the person you are supposed to obey, or to the one you who are doing the obeying. If it does, and if it is, then it is a command from God, and if not, you should be suspicious of it. Jesus showed that love involves some measure of sacrifice, sometimes even the ultimate sacrifice. No one has greater love than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Jesus was not less because he laid down his life in a sacrificial love. He was more. And when we obey the command to do the same for others, we are adding to our life. We are not losing our life. It's hard not to think of mothers in this regard today. Children are, we hope, all of them conceived in love. And the moment they are, the mother begins to bear them. Mothers sacrifice their own bodies to make room for the child growing within them. And even after birth, mothers often put off their own career ambitions or put them on hold, revise them altogether out of love for their children. And sometimes mothers, because of their family circumstances, have to actually go back to work out of love for their children in order to support them and give them opportunities they otherwise would not have, even if she might have preferred to stay at home to care for them. Mothers put their kids ahead of themselves, and they never stop to ask themselves if that is right. They are obeying a command that is not burdensome. They love that way because their hearts have simply been taken over by a devotion to their kids. But the obedience of loving isn't always as natural as what happens between a mother and her children, or between two people who are so smitten with each other that it doesn't seem like a sacrifice to love. Sometimes loving is hard. Sometimes loving other children of God is an act of obedience that you don't really feel like following. Sometimes we don't feel like it because we don't think the person we are commanded to love deserves it. But that leads to the third thing that takes us back to the first thing. We obey the command to love others by seeing others through Christ, not by seeing them in themselves. See, that's actually the way God sees us. We are unworthy and undeserving, each of us and all of us. And so God sees us through the only one who is worthy. And so must we learn to do the same for others. And I'll be perfectly frank with you. This has to be the hardest thing for any of us, isn't it? I mean, it is for me, because some people are either unwilling or unable to live up to expectations, it seems, for what they should do or should be as responsible human beings, and these are the hardest to love. But what's the secret? Dorothy Day was a remarkable Christian who started the Catholic worker movement on the Lower East Side in New York City a century ago, and this included a storefront relief center for the hungry and the poor. Dorothy believed that the command to love others required a certain, here's her phrase, disarmament of the heart. See, she thought we had to learn to let go of the entitlement that we feel to judge others as to whether they deserve our love or not. That's a power that gets in the way of doing what we are commanded. But the secret to it is found in this story she tells. A friend sent us $1 yesterday, and with it the remark, "Enclosed is for bread, but not to make bums out of those who should be earning their own." I thought about that this morning when I passed a little group of 4 who always seemed to be hanging around the place, out in front, in the coffee room, in the doorways, always drunk, sometimes prostrate on the sidewalk, sometimes sitting on the curb. They give a picture of despair or hilarity according to the mood they're in, and to the minds of many of our friends, they epitomize the 600 or so who come here to eat every day. This morning as I came from Mass, I passed the little vegetable woman around the corner washing her mustard greens in a large barrel of cold water. Her hands were raw and cold. It was one of those gray mornings, wet and misty, and the pavement was slimy underfoot. I commiserated with her over her hands, and she said, "What are you going to do? If you don't work, you don't eat." When I passed this same little knot of men in front of the house whom I had passed on the way to church, I told them about the little Italian woman. And they hung their heads sheepishly and went away. I don't know what can be done except to pray. Here are the most humiliated of men, the most despised, the evidence of their sins flagrant and ever present. And as to what brought them to this pass, war and poverty, disease and sorrow, who can tell? Why question? We must see Christ everywhere, even in his most degraded guise. How was she able to overcome her antipathy toward those men and to love them as she was commanded? Only by seeing them through Christ and not seeing them only as themselves. There's a kind of circular logic to what John the Elder tells us in this passage. God loves God's Son, Jesus, with an overflowing love that loves us through him, and we are to love Jesus with that overflowing love as the Son of God, the worthy one, and all his unworthy sisters and brothers at the same time. And when we do that, then we return love to God. There are many of us who are working hard in this legislative session to advocate for the 5.5 million children who attend public schools in Texas, along with the teachers and administrators who serve them. The criticism of those who teach and work in these schools is sometimes bordering on ungodly. They are not perfect, any of them, but neither are their critics. They often work against great odds, given the family circumstances some kids come from, low family expectations, low community support, low self-esteem. I tell you, it's the perfect trifecta for low achievement. But instead of trying to strengthen public schools, we have people, politicians right now, trying to cut the legs out from under them through an obsession with testing, limited funding, and voucher programs being proposed that would only pull a few kids from public schools and put them in private schools, and that at taxpayer expense, leaving the rest behind to fall behind even more. But from South Carolina this week, of all places, comes some hope. An expression of the obedience of love. The comedian Stephen Colbert has written a check for over $800,000 so that every single public school teacher who made a grant proposal request for funds to be able to better teach their kids and have supplies so that they could do their job, which were not funded by the school system themselves or taxpayers, every single one of those grants in total were funded by Stephen Colbert. There was no attempt to evaluate the worthiness of each of them. His assumption was that those children were worthy and the effort was good, and he acted instead as a Christian because that's what motivates him, out of the obedience of love. I wonder what would happen in all of our schools, in all of our families, in all of our churches, in all of our workplaces, in all of our relationships, if we, each of us, resolve the paradox of love and obedience that way. Amen.